He's here for number 5, appearance number 5. Chris Rainsforth from Verint. Welcome, sir. You're
Hello,
leading the
hello,
pack.
hello.
You're leading the pack now. So this is episode 63, and we're going to start doing things. We're going to introduce a bit of a theme, and that is an episode that people can listen to. This is the theory. An episode that people can listen to, where we'll take a topic and we'll just share some tips. So whether it's by getting the text or listening to it, hopefully it can add value. And for the first one, we've chosen a topic close to both our hearts and our experience back in the day, and that is team leader tips. So maybe you've just become a new team leader, or you're an existing one. Hopefully you'll find something from the tips. Now, Chris, you have given me a list of 10, and we're going to go through them. But firstly, why do people say in our industry that team leaders are the most important kind of group of people?
I think for me, it is. I think, from an agent to a team leader, they're your gatekeeper, right, of your organisation. And the team leader is one of the most important ones, because they're responsible for not just the development of a good group of people, but actually that escalation point. Typically it's an escalation route for the customer. Is that first line of defence, if they do want to speak to someone outside of that. There's a lot of responsibility there, and I think we sometimes forget about the team leader as a role sometimes, just because we concentrate on the advisor, which is right. We do need to develop those people, but sometimes we just forget the team leader and the important part they play in the wider cog of the contact center. So I think this episode is just about calling out from our experiences. You mentioned it. We've had a very similar trajectory in life, in terms of the contact center world. And I think just going back and looking at some of the mistakes I made as a team leader, I think, I wasn't saying I wasn't a perfect team leader by any stretch of the imagination, but, there's a lot that I learned in terms of growing up in that role, and about people and about kind of all those little things that I think we could probably help new team leaders on their journey, or, current team leaders that just want to refresh themselves on what things they should be concentrating on.
Yeah, brilliant. One thing I was remiss in me as well is I don't think this is just about team leaders listening to this. I think sometimes senior leaders miss out the impact that team leaders can have on implementing a strategy. I'll never forget leaving a briefing as a contact center manager. So all my team leaders came with me. We left a briefing about a new initiative, and as they went out to their team and I was walking to get a coffee, I heard one of the team leaders was asked a question, what was that about? And they said, it just yet another crazy scheme, blah, blah. They kind of instantly dismissed it, undermined it. And I remember thinking that's going to be really tough for that team now to get them to really buy into what we want to try and do here. And it just shows the importance of that team leader.
They are the motivator of the contact center, right? I think in most cases, and one of the key things, and we might go on to when we get into the hints and tips, but their mood and their behavior will shape a team, and it's important. And I think you're right. Then the level above, the operations managers or the contact center managers, whatever the hierarchy looks like, they've still got to take kind of ownership of that development and that motivation, because they're going to be, again, the conduit to kind of driving that frontline performance. And I think, let's give them the tools they need to do a really good job and support them and kind of, encourage them and all those things. And I think sometimes we just forget, and I don't think we do it on purpose. I don't think there's a nastiness to it in any way, shape, or form. I just think, it's that trajectory, isn't it, of kind of advisor, team leader, operations manager, and you kind of do that. And I think sometimes we forget as we move through that kind of chain or up that kind of ladder, that the things that worked 20 years ago still fundamentally work today. We just have to do them a little bit differently. And sometimes when, you know, you kind of come up with an idea, we've probably done it before at some point, and it might have worked or it might not. But I think we just dismiss things too readily because things have failed before, rather than going, okay, so why did it fail that time? What can we do differently to make it work this time? Because actually the outcome, the benefit that we're trying to drive is where we want to be. So let's do something different to make it work. And I think, yeah, we just need to be really careful around how we how that kind of plays its way out through the kind of management team.
Especially as I guess as a new team leader, being given license to fail is really important. But anyway, we could talk. I'm going to try and go through your list. So, number 1 on your list was be consistent and fair.
Yes, I think yes, right. So it seems really simple thing to say, but again, I think what we need to really be clear here is that consistency is a great motivator for people, and fairness within a team is a motivator. You know, and we've all worked in those environments sometime where, you know, someone might be performing poorly, or, you know, someone might be performing well, and actually we're not treating people in the same way. And, you know, sometimes people, you know, you see people getting away with stuff, for want of a better phrase, and you go, well, why is that not being challenged? You know, why is that behavior not being challenged? And but then we challenge a different behavior, and you just think, well, if you're challenging that behavior, why are you not challenging the other behavior? What is it? It has to be consistency, and that motivates people. If people know they're going to be treated fairly, if they're going to be their performance management and development time, and, you know, the opportunities to kind of step up, or kind of be involved in special projects, or well, if that's going to be consistent and not the same person every time or the same group of people every time, it motivates people to work harder, to work smarter, and get involved, and have that opportunity to kind of step up when they can. And, you know, I think it's, for me, one of the key things that we need to remember, and that's, you know, across all management styles, but I think consistency and fairness is really important.
I used to it's a great point, and I used to say the danger here is you're going to move, if you've moved from peer group to team leader, you will have people you're friendlier with than others.
Yeah.
And there's a real danger there. And like you say, the other one could be you're a high performer versus a low performer. For me, it was about 2 things. Number 1, do the work to understand your policies as soon as possible, because you can rely on them to give you what is consistent treatment of people, HR policies, operational policies. Number 2, be careful that you don't set precedent. That was always the thing that was kind of drummed into me was, okay, you might say to someone, yeah, you can go and do this today because they've done well or whatever. You've then made it impossible to say no to anyone else who asks the same question without looking like you're favoring people. So it's, you want to be popular, don't you, when you first move into that team leader position? You want everyone to like you and respond well to you. Don't be afraid, though, to say no when you're not, you know, if it means the toss up between being consistent and not, always be consistent. So I think that's a great point to start with. Number 2 on your list was develop yourself.
Yeah, and take that time to develop yourself. You know, I speak about this a lot around, you never know everything. You just don't. You might think you do, but you don't, right? But you can always learn, and you can always learn, and you can always get better at what you want, you know, in terms of how you want to perform, you know, your behavior, your attitudes, you know, your kind of knowledge, those things, you can all take time to do that. And I think if you're not investing in yourself, it's hard to invest in other people, because you'll reach a plateau, and then if you're learning as stilted, then that will manifest itself on your team and on the people around you. So I think it's really important to be just as focused on your own development as it is the development of your team and you know, the guys that you're there to look after.
Another great one, and it reminds me of a little story of I was managing a group of team leaders, and we had access to online courses that our LMS team had uploaded. And there was a load in there about management and being a better manager and coaching. And I nagged, pushed these guys, cajoled them, tried to show them the reasons why it'd be good for them to do it in their own time, to work through these courses to make them better at their job. Fast forward about a year, and I would regularly revisit who had done what courses because I could see it. Fast forward a year, and unfortunately, the contact center we were in had to do some cost cutting. So we had to hone down the team leader population. And we met as a group of managers and HR. And when they were looking at the matrix to determine how do we assess team leaders that are doing very different jobs, blah, 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 someone suggested, well, why can we look at whether their growth mindset, whether they are out there looking for work. And of course, I said we could use the LMS system. And it was kind of, for me, it was a perfect example of do your work, do your work on that development. And if you don't know where to look, there's plenty of resources, but you can also be requiring of people within the contact center to say, I still want to develop, I still want to learn, teach me.
Yeah, and and that's the key thing. You said it before. You typically you go from an advisor to a team leader, and in some way, that's kind of your progression path. I don't know if you can hear the dog barking. Apologies if you can.
We're all used to it. It makes it. Yeah, I love it. It makes us real, doesn't it?
I don't know. He's barking at his own shadow, probably. So typically we've gone through that path, and and I did this research a few years ago. And I think I've mentioned it before that as an actual age group. The team leader is one of the youngest in any industry for where you've got that level of responsibility. Average age back then, when I did it 3 years ago, was around 22, I think was the average age of a team leader in the industry. And that's low, right? That is really young. And, and I've seen examples of it. I was a team leader at 18, you kind of think, I know what it was like at 18. I've got no idea why anybody gave me any responsibility then. But, you are, but when you're that young, there is a tendency sometimes to go, well, I've got promoted. I know I'm good at what I'm doing. So now I'll just forget about myself because I've reached that level. And, you might then move on and kind of promote up again. But typically you have that level of just stagnation for a while to go, well, I've been promoted. I'm the big I am. And you can fall into that trap sometimes. And I think let's just remember that you can always get better. You can always learn and balance the type of leader you want to be, and then learn how to be that type of leader. And you don't necessarily have to be that person 24/7, but you can be that person for the 8 hours that you're working. And if that's who you want to be, put on that, I call it the work persona, or that kind of character that you play when you go into work. And with that takes time. It takes time to learn how to be that person, learn how to be that type of mentor or leader. And you've got to give yourself time to develop. You just have to.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think I've taken bits and bobs and tips and ways of dealing with things from every leader I've worked for, even sometimes where it's the negative, kind of like you're going, right, well, I'm never going to do that.
Yeah.
But that's about being inquisitive, isn't it?
Yeah.
Number 3, don't cancel value add meetings.
Yeah. This is a big bugbear of mine. In our role as team leaders is to develop people, and we can sometimes forget that because we're dealing with the customer, and I get that, right? So don't get me wrong, I've worked in this industry long enough to know that the customer, we've got to look after the customer. But what we sometimes fall in the trap of is going, oh, we're having a busy day, or something's busy, so I'm going to cancel that coaching session this afternoon, or I'll cancel that one-to-one, or whatever it is, because I need to do this, or deal with this escalation, or whatever it might be. What we sometimes forget then is to reschedule. So I just think, if we're investing in our people, and we're trying to be consistent, and we're trying to be fair, then everyone deserves their value-add activity. Everyone deserves that time to develop. We've just said we need to give ourselves time to develop. You need to offer that same development opportunity to your people. And if we fall into the trap of cancelling those activities, it soon becomes disproportionate. So, you know, if you're not cancelling fairly, essentially, and it might be the same person because, oh, it's a Wednesday and I've always got Martin's coaching session on a Wednesday, it's just
And
unlucky.
he's a nightmare.
And then Martin's had a coaching session for 6 months, right? But someone else might have had all their sessions. So it's that thing of going, be really mindful around how you utilize that value add activity. And if you do need to move it and commit to a new time there and then. So, you know, have the conversations. I can't, you know, today, Martin, I'm going to have to move your session, but look, I can put it in tomorrow morning instead. So you're committing and you're giving that time and you're not forgetting that time's important. You know, so I think we have to be mindful. I know sometimes you've got to balance that with your planning team and make sure that you can do those things, which is fine. You know, the tools are all there now to help with that, to make sure time's rescheduled and that type of stuff. So yeah, just don't cancel it. I think it becomes really demoralizing if the opportunity to develop continually gets taken away from the individual. I think, you know, so yeah, that's one that I think I'm really passionate about, making sure that value add time is committed to.
And rightly so, protect the people stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
Number 4, don't shy away from difficult conversations.
Yes, on 2 fronts, right? So the first front, which I've been guilty of, I'm sure some team leaders listening to this will have been guilty of, is that I want to speak to a manager. I'll just tell them I'm busy.
Yeah.
All right, just tell them I'm busy, because we don't want to deal with that escalation. But I think that takes away credibility, and it is part and parcel of the role, right? Sometimes you've got to take the escalation, you've got to deal with it. And I think if you continually refuse to have that difficult conversation, your team will lose respect for you very, very quickly, in terms of, because fundamentally you're there to support them. And yes, 9 times out of 10, the answer you give that customer might be the same answer that your really well-trained advisor has given them, but that's not the point, right? The point is the customer wants to speak to someone else. So kind of don't shy away from it. Get involved and show that you're supporting your team, because that's fundamentally what it's about. You know, the customer's secondary in this for me. You know, we need to deal with the customer and deal with that escalation. But the first thing that should be on your mind is actually my advisor having a difficult time here. So I need to protect that advisor, and I'm going to go and I'm going to stand, you know, I'll take that call, and then we can do some development potentially, or coaching afterwards, to kind of how we can manage the escalations in the future. So don't shy away from that one. And then similarly with your people, I think sometimes when we've got to have a difficult conversation, whether it's around performance or attitude or behaviour, back to your point, especially if you've been promoted within and you're friendly with some of those people within your team, again, you've got to lay a marker in terms of the respect that your team will have for you, the type of leader that you want to be. Not saying go in and start being really kind of argumentative and confrontational, but if you need to have a conversation with someone about the way they behave or the attitude, or that, you've got to have it. The longer you put it off, goes back to that first point around consistency and fairness. The longer you put it off, it would typically be other people have noticed that behavior or that attitude or that performance, and if they see you continually not having that conversation, again, that respect, that credibility, those types of things start to be diminished. So yeah, you know, on both sides, difficult conversations are part and parcel of the role. You know, it's part of it's one of the terms and conditions if you accept the role as a leader. We can't shy away from them. We you've got to deal with them and as quickly as you can. Really, don't let them fester.
I think that's, again, great points, mate, because especially having a difficult conversation with one of your team members, even just talking about it, I can feel some nerves in my belly, just as a reminder of the very first time you had to do it, and maybe you put it off, and maybe you thought, maybe this person will stop doing this thing that I need to talk to them about, or maybe it'll just go away. It doesn't. No. And the longer you leave it, the worse it gets. So just do it. And maybe the first time it won't go so great, but actually there will be people around you that have had difficult conversations in the past that can help you structure that conversation so that it isn't as bad as you think. And I think some of it, again, comes down to this point around expectations. So being able to talk to your team as a group and saying to them from the outset, I'm going to help you, I'm going to develop you, but I am going to call you out on stuff that you shouldn't be doing, and I'm going to do it consistently. So it's not a surprise then when you do it, but you do have to do it, to your point.
Yeah.
It is part of the job.
Yeah. And, I think we just, again, it is just about finding that right, again, who you want to be as a leader, firm, fairness, whatever it is. But you're right. There'll be people in the organisation, other team leaders, more experience that you can discuss it with. There's even the option, isn't there? And, it kind of, you're speaking to your leader, so your ops manager or your call center manager, going, look, this is the problem I've got. This is the situation I have. What's the best way to approach it? And just ask for help. Ask for help if you're struggling with those types of things. It does take time to build up that resilience and that skill, to have that conversation and be empathetic and be decisive, and those types of things takes time. And everyone's been in that situation, so use the experience of those around you to help you, for sure.
Definitely. Actually, this does then link into your number 5, the balance between a friend and a boss.
Yeah, again, we mentioned it a couple of times.
Sounds very David Brent, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Chilled out entertainer.
It does, right? But it is, we work in contact center. It's such a close-knit environment, right? We've got a lot of people get promoted within. They've been advisors, they're now team leaders, and sometimes it's hard to separate, right? The kind of friendship and the kind of fact that you're now responsible for people that you might go out with on a Friday night. That's part and parcel of it. Again, goes back to what I said, decide who you want to be as a leader, but still got to maintain that boundary. And, it can blur very quickly, I think, in the contact center, that kind of that friend to boss role. And again, if you then are using that friendship to stop you doing the things that you need to do as a leader, so having those difficult conversations and making sure you're being fair and consistent and challenging when you need to challenge, if it's stopping you doing those things, then you've probably gone too far over one way, and you just need to take a step back and reflect and say, right, how do I get myself back into a point of respect where those boundaries can be easily defined? Not saying it's easy, and I've been guilty of it. I'm pretty sure a lot of people have been guilty of it in kind of early career, of kind of not having that right balance. But it is one of the things that I see as a risk. And I'm not saying don't be friends with any of your team. That's not what I'm trying to say at all. It's just making sure the delineation is there between what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I think, again, really good point. For me, there's like a spectrum, and as long as you're being true to yourself, you never use your friendship to gain something, and equally, you don't kind of become. There's a tendency, I think, especially when you're new into the role, that you're more of a union rep than a leader. Yeah. So you're more like, I'm going to I'll fight every battle for you, and that's not your role. Equally, another extreme that, again, luckily in a minority I've seen, is people become authoritarian. Yeah. Because they feel like they're playing up to that role, and that's easier for them to deal with than maneuvering around a previous relationship. To become authoritarian when it's not actually who you are is really dangerous. You can instantly alienate yourself, people won't respect you.
It's especially if they've known you, right? That's the thing, is that you kind of go from. And I said to you jokingly when we said let's have a look at what we're going to call out something. But it goes back to that first one that I said. Don't be a dick, right? You've taken that.
There was only one on the list to start with.
Yeah, but that, and I think it filters through. Right? That is the point. You've taken a step up. People know you. They know what your personality is like. They typically will know you as an individual, what you like, what you don't like. And then just because you've been promoted, why change who you are? It doesn't work like that. You've just got to rebalance. I always think it's that thing of going, everyone's equal. We've just got different responsibilities. That's my mantra on everything, right? No matter where you are and what you do, we're all of equal value, we've just got different responsibilities, and your responsibility as a team leader is a responsibility for your team, your group of people, and their performance and development. That's your new responsibility. So embrace that responsibility. Just make sure you've got the clear balance in terms of, what's friendly, what isn't. It's
well,
you're in
exactly
control.
right, mate. Don't be a dick, and don't let anyone at a senior level or anyone tell you can't have friends at different levels, because you can. And you must, because they'll last longer than the job probably.
Yeah, for sure. I say one of the first contact centres I worked in, 20 odd years, right? And I'm best pals with one of the guys I first met on my first day of induction, right? You kind of, we've both gone on in completely separate directions now, but still go for a beer when we're allowed and whatnot, So yeah, the friendship.
Number 6, communicate.
Yes, communicate. Sorry, I had a little visitor there. My daughter just appeared for those watching on YouTube, but in from school. So communication's key. I think it links everything together, right? That we've talked around so far, is making sure you communicate effectively, but consistently, and kind of letting people know, I think, what they can expect from you, what's happening in the business. I kind of hate this idea of knowledge is power, and I've worked with leaders that would keep information in because they felt it put them in a kind of better bargaining position, or whatever the reasoning was. And you think, well, if I knew that information, I can actually arm my team to do a better job. I can give them additional development, I can do whatever. So I think communication's critical, in terms of what their expectations are, what the expectations you have of them, how that expectation is being met or not, performance management, and making sure that's consistent and regular, and all those things help. And I think even more so in today's world, where we have that potential of managing a distributed workforce, where we might have some people in the office, some people at home, we might have, that now I think communication becomes even more important, even if it's just that regular check-in time with people to make sure they're okay and they're coping, and all those things all comes from a basis of good communication, and making sure, again, you're taking time for your team and giving them the information they need, but also giving them the support they need, and being open and available and all that good stuff.
I think this one also falls into the don't cancel value. So I used to have 2 rules for my team leaders: was make sure you talk to everyone in your team at least once in the day, so that there wasn't someone that could come in, work their entire shift and walk out and you haven't interacted with them. And number 2 was talk to your team as a group. And one of the challenges that I got, which might sound common to many, is my team are on 2 different shifts, and my answer was do it twice. I'm only talking about a 5-10 minute huddle of, hey guys, here's where we're at, here's what's new, be careful of the vending machine, whatever it was. If you have to, do it twice. What is more important than communicating with your team or interacting with them? There shouldn't be anything.
And I think if you are finding yourself with too much work, or whatever that looks like, you again might be looking at development, you might be getting asked to do special projects by your manager or whatever. Same rules apply, right? That you have to have that conversation and push back and say, look, I don't mind doing this stuff, but it's taken away from what my actual role is, and my role, and my team are suffering because I'm being dragged and doing some additional stuff over here. You control you control you control how you use your time on a day-to-day basis. And if the things you're doing are impacting actually spending time with your team, then you need to take a step back and have a look at that and go, actually, I need to change kind of some of my priorities here. But yeah, it's it's easy to say communicate, it's difficult to master.
Yeah, it's true. It's like it's a skill that you can get better at. So about introverted team leaders who the thought of standing up and talking to their team when we were in a contact center, or I guess even now doing it on Zoom or Teams, it's actually very nerve-wracking. And they would say, I'm not an orator, I don't like it. There's a different style. Just be yourself. You can, if it's within a contact center, you don't have to stand up, sit down, get everyone together, just talk to them. And I used to say to my team, even if they don't hear everything you've said, but you're there talking to them every day, that's the whole point, is you're showing up, you're talking to them, and you're trying to create that esprit de corps that comes from clear communication. So I love that one. Number 7, treat team members as individuals.
Yeah, we are often guilty of sheep dipping. I assume that translates.
I love that one. Yeah, I love it. No,
but we
would often say, have they gone through the sheep dip of induction?
Yeah, and we're very guilty of it as an industry, right? I think we have been for as long as I've been in induction programs, and then the kind of coaching cycles, and everyone's got the same KPIs with the same targets.
Get him under.
Yeah, I mean, we've just we've become very guilty of it, and it's not as bad now as it was. But I think the key thing for being a team leader is getting to know your people. When we get to know the people, we can then treat them as individuals. Now, when I mean get to know them, yes, understand their family life and personal life and kind of that. But more importantly, things around, what is their learning style? What actually motivates them? What are the things that they're going to respond to when you do? Some people are really respondent to targets and KPIs and putting a number in front of them, and they love it, right? But then you've got people that don't respond to that or don't react to that type of management. So, it can't be a one size fits all. It has to be a tailored journey for each of your team if you're going to get the best out of them. It takes effort, but back to what we've said, you're responsible here. Trying to do everything in the same way will have varying results. You will get better results when you start to do things in a personal and kind of targeted and tailored way for the people on your team. 100%.
Love it. Number 8, involve everyone.
Yeah, I think it goes back a little bit to consistency and fairness, right? But I think, and understanding your individuality of your team, involve people consistently, but involve people in a way. Someone at the door. Sorry. 2 seconds. I'm just going to wear. It's a really middle class problem. My tea and coffee delivery man's come. How ridiculous is that? This old Yorkshire lad now getting his tea and coffee.
Oh, look at this! Yeah,
ridiculous. But yeah,
so dream of getting tea and coffee delivered.
But yeah, when we go back about involving everybody, it goes back to all those things that we're trying to get to, right? So understand what they're trying to do, and just make sure we're not forgetting people. Make sure, especially if we've got people in a distributed team, there always is a risk that you go to the same group of people. To your point before, if you've got people on an early shift and you're in early as a team leader, that actually that group that started at 8 o'clock with you will get all the good jobs for the day potentially. And then by the time I come in at 12 o'clock in the afternoon, all that kind of overtime's gone, that special project work's been given out already, and I've not had the chance to kind of get involved. We've involved everyone and involve the people in terms of what they want to do. So once you understand what their development path is, you understand what their ambition is and where they want to get, you can start to involve people differently and go, what, I can concentrate on that, but then get the agreement across the team and say, this is what I'm looking to do. Is everyone happy with that? Rather than it being a kind of, I'm just going to do it and hopefully everyone likes what I'm doing. I think we've got to be really mindful of making sure we don't forget about people and don't forget about where people want to be. I've worked with people that have been ambitious and wanted to progress, and I can tailor their development to do that. But I've also worked with people that, quite happy sitting there for the rest of their career, just answering calls 9 to 5, and they're fine with that. They've got no other ambition, but what they want to be is the best they can be in that role. So, you know, I can then involve them and do things with them that makes them the best that they can be. You know, so I think, yeah, you know, let's just not forget people. I think we run the risk of doing it because of the nature of our business.
And that runs nicely actually into your next one, number 9, which was delegate.
Yeah, again, you know, you can't, you don't have to do everything yourself, right? You don't, right? And we've probably all tried to, but it's not healthy. And part of development for yourself is the ability to delegate and have confidence in people to be able to do things. I'm not saying delegate everything because it's tasks you don't like doing, you know. So I'll go back to that, you know, I've seen it before. Oh, Martin, you're today, you can be on manager escalations because I can't be bothered taking them calls.
Yeah.
You know, be careful
Yeah.
what we delegate. And you know, it's like, you know, don't just give away the stuff that you don't like doing. Goes back to everything we said: individuality, personal development, personal growth, and then utilizing your team's strength to kind of A, develop themselves, but B, give you time to do some of the value add activities. So if you've got tasks and things that are taking up the time that you need developing your team, then some of that can be delegated. You know, I would imagine you can delegate some of that activity. That then makes sure you're not cancelling those coaching sessions, you're not cancelling those one-to-ones, and you're actually giving your team something, you know, additionally valuable to do in terms of their own personal growth. So, you know, yeah, delegate, learn to delegate. If you don't learn to delegate, you'll become very bogged down very quickly.
Don't underestimate the power of giving people something to do that breaks up their day. So I had a team leader, and she said, I really struggle getting ready to do my morning brief with the guys because I have to update the whiteboard, update our figures, complete some other paperwork. And I said, look, you've got 12 to 15 people who might jump at the chance. And we pretty much delegated everything. So you had someone that updated the whiteboard. What did that do? Sounds menial, but actually got them involved in knowing what the figures were and how to check on the systems what our figures were. You know, we had people looking out for the wall boards and calls queuing and things like that. We had people that completed reports every day, and so on and so on. You know, and it kind of you've got to just ask. You'll be surprised. You will be surprised if you ask.
Agreed.
I've got a list of tasks here. Does anybody want to do them?
Yeah, you know, go back, ask. Yeah, people will jump at the chance to do stuff, you know, and I think just I can't relate to people that want to take on everything and not actually look at it as an opportunity to use some of that activity to develop people, but give people some responsibility for stuff. And you know, there's lots of those things that we can do. So yeah, learning to delegate and delegating smartly and consistently, it's a skill. It's a skill that needs developing. Make sure you delegate in the right work. You know, you delegate to people that have got the right capabilities and things like that. But yeah, it's a critical part, I think, of being a team leader, the ability to delegate.
Love it. Number 10, be decisive.
Yes, indecision is the root of all evil. That's what I say. And I think you have to be, right? And if we don't make decisions quickly, I'm not saying make rash decisions, make well thought out decisions, but be decisive. Don't kind of flip flop between one way or the other. I think there has to be a level of decisiveness because it builds, again, credibility, builds respect within your team when you are decisive on issues, you know, decisive on what the reward might be, what even the punishment might be, you know, all those things of kind of going, let's be decisive in how we approach the day, how we approach our kind of our team. I think if every time you get asked a question, you can't give an answer or make a decision, you'll soon be stopped asking questions, right? Some people just go, I'm not going to ask him a question because he never gives me a right answer.
Get the magic 8-ball.
Yeah. But it is that thing of going, you know, I've seen it a few times in my career where you'll see something happening in the operation, and an advisor will get up and they'll walk past 3 team leaders to get to one at the other end of the contact centre, because they know they'll get the right support, the right help, the right thing, and they know the other 3 will either fob them off, not give them an answer now, and then they're no further forward. So yeah, it is. We've just, this indecision is I think it's a really bad trait, and one that when we're in a leadership position, we need to be mindful of. How do we make that decision? How can we be decisive and make sure everyone knows where to stand quickly?
Love it. So I've added a couple of others. See what you think of these. So number 11, establish relationships, and I don't mean within your team and assume peers and your line manager. I mean with the support functions in the contact center. So go and see them, go and spend some time with them, introduce yourself, get to know them. I did it in every department. So whether it was finance, workforce management, obviously HR, spent a lot of time there. Only understanding policies, policies and things. What's even facilities? Just make sure that people know who you are. I think it's really important that you can utilize those relationships when you need them, but B, get a better understanding of where you are and the decisions you make about your team sit within the contact center.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think relationship building is critical outside of the contact center. HR is a good one, so get to know your HR rep, because they are your lifeline when it comes to policy and things like that. You might go years without dealing with a difficult situation within your team, but guarantee at some point you will. And then having that HR representative being, you've built that relationship, they can help you and guide you through any process that you need to, if that's critical. I think, some of the other contact center supporting functions, the resource planning team, they're your best mate. They have to be your best mate because they influence a lot of everything. So get to know your planning team, get to understand their planning process, and how are they actually set up to forecast and schedule, and all those little things that we take for granted around time off and rearranging coaching sessions and those types of things. If you know your planning team and you understand their process, helping that decision making process for you going forward becomes really easy. And I think everyone outside of that, the quality team, if you've got a separate team for that, I think they're really important to understand. Again, building your knowledge and confidence around why they do things the way they do it, what's important to them, what are their outcomes, and what are they being measured on, and stuff like sometimes we have this type of relationship with other functions within the contact center outside of the front line, and it needs to be more of a collaboration than headbutting, because they're all being managed to a certain standard. And if we don't understand what each other's standard and expectations are, we'll never work cohesively as a unit. So yeah, establishing relationships outside of that kind of contact center for me, really important. It's a good one.
And the last one is actually, you sent it at the bottom of your list in caps. It wasn't the don't be a dick one. It was enjoy it. And that's one as well. I just think is really important, that too many times I've seen team leaders look like they're carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders, and they kind of play up to it. So they're always walking around looking stressed. And we had to move some teams around because there's some new starters. And I had a particular team leader who always looked stressed, was always, I'm too busy. Again, looked really unhappy all the time. And people didn't want to move into his team because of that. And I just think there's nothing, this is a great role if you can just enjoy it. You're going to work with up to 15, maybe even 20 people who look to you for leadership. And being a leader isn't being the most stressed person. You're sending out all the wrong signals. And if you are unhappy in the role, then you need to do something about it or question whether you're in that role, because it shouldn't be a role that makes you miserable.
For me, it's I'll say it. If you enjoy it, you never work a day in your life, right? And I think it's true. I think in terms of enjoying this role, I think it's such a perfect position in the sense that you've got loads of capability to still grow and develop, but you've also got that responsibility that allows you to develop your own character and your personality and your style and all those things. And I think if you're not enjoying it, back to your point, you need to question if the role's right for you, because I think it can be one of the most rewarding roles that you'll have in your career. You know, and I look back at the lessons I learned as a team leader 20 years ago and still learn from them today. You know, they were the building blocks in terms of who I became as I became, you know, an adult, for want of a better phrase. But as I grew up, and as I
grown up,
you know, as I grew up and started to develop, the lessons I learned when I was a team leader, you know, they're what shaped me into the man that I am today. And did I make some bad decisions when I was a team leader? Yeah. Did I do some wrong things when I was team leader? Yeah, for sure I did. You know, I think, you know, most people would be lying if they say they go through everything and it's been perfect. I think, but it's those things that although we fear failure, that actually those small failures are what you then use to learn and develop and become better going forward. So soak it in now, take it in now, enjoy it now, because it's over like that. It's in a flash, right? Unless you end up, you know, if your career decision is stay there. You know, I was a team leader probably for 2 years, really, and then I moved into a training role, and then into an ops leadership role, and then kind of went from there. So that period of being a team leader was relatively short in my career, but I probably learned more in that short period than I have done in any other role I've had.
Exactly. Well, Chris, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. We'll make the tips available all over the place that you can find. Get Out a Rap. We're all repping it, aren't we, today, Chris? Look, you've got the T-shirt, the phone case.
Fully branded.
Full duvet set and pillow coming.
Get some wallpaper.
But Chris, thanks very much. Like I said, we're going to be doing a series of these. So we're going to try and do one once a week, once every other week, in amongst all the usual episodes. And hopefully you will have gained something from it. Chris, thanks a lot for we're kind of like a double act now.
My pleasure. Yeah, I feel like I spend more time talking.
Our northern correspondent. And for those of you who don't know, Chris did have a Leeds backdrop on, so haven't Leeds done well this season, mate?
Been great, mate. You know, I've had the season of my life, and it's been, you know, I kind of go back to when we went into Europe, and the last time I watched every game in the season was the season we went to the San Siro and beat AC Milan and got to the semi-finals, the Champions League. That was the last time I'd been to every game in the season. And then circumstance and work and moving kind of slowly diminished. And this has been the first season in forever long that I've actually watched every game of the season because of, unfortunately, COVID situation. But that meant that every game has been shown. So actually to see our progression over this year and watches and how we've played football and how we've attacked it has made my absolute year, really. Yeah, let's see what we do next year. Champions. That's what I'm saying. Here first.
That's going to be Tottenham, mate. We're going to go from bust to boom.
Well, something's got to change, hasn't it?
Well, we're either going to do really well or everything's going to fall apart. So I kind of flip-flop between the two every other minute.
Something's got to change. But it's been a funny season this season. I kind of look at it and go,
if you look,
every Premier League, every season in the Premier League, you know, you've needed 40 points to be safe, right? And if you look at it this year, 29 points would have kept you safe. I mean, that for me just says, I don't think it says the league's been any less quality. It's just been a really strange season because of the lack of fans. And I think that's impacted a lot of teams in terms of that fourth, you know, that extra man that you get from having that kind of atmosphere and the team, you know, getting behind you and getting the adrenaline going. So hopefully next year everyone's back in, we've got full crowds, and the league will rebalance itself a bit.
So join us next week on Leeds and Tottenham TV for another episode. Thanks, mate.
Cheers, mate. Speak to you soon.
Bye-bye.